walking in a country road, and I've been chasing after my shadow.
Welcome back to the Camino Podcast, episode 101. I'm Dave Whitson.
Nobody asked me my name.
We kick off the new century with another jaunt on the Camino del Norte, pushing deeper into Asturias as we proceed from Colombres to La Isla. This part of Spain has its own distinct microclimate, as the Picos de Europa tower high above just to the south, creating a very narrow stretch of land between mountain and ocean. Most of that elevation remains off route, though. While there are certainly some ups and downs, this is, relatively speaking, a less strenuous section of the Norte. I'll explore these 73 kilometers from three very distinct perspectives. Our pilgrim of the day is Austin Cook, who has completed several tours of duty on the Norte. Beyond the walk itself, he has some entertaining and moving stories to share from churches and bars along the way. He's followed by experts on two quite different topics. First, Dr. Laura Hydak joins me for a discussion about the Indianos people. The Indianos were Spanish immigrants to the Americas, some of whom returned wealthy to Spain later on. They left a distinct architectural mark in the region, including in Colombres, where today's walk begins. Then, Dr. Mark Pizzato takes me underground to explore some of the prehistoric cave art that is accessible to pilgrims along the Norte, including the Cueva del Pindal at the beginning of this section, and the Tito Bustillo cave near the end. And with his theater background, Mark is able to not only discuss the art itself, but also the theatricality of the creative and performative experience within the cave. So there you go, from Colombres to La Isla, and from prehistory to modernity. Hope you enjoy. Austin Cook of Ottawa, Ontario, thank you for speaking with me today about the Camino del Norte.
Happy to talk about it. It's probably one of my favorite Caminos. I've done a whole bunch of them over the years, 12 in all. The Française, of course, but also I celebrated my retirement by walking from Mont Saint-Michel in France down to Santiago. Took me over 2 months.
Wow.
And I've done the Catalan several times because I love the excuse to go up to San Juan de la Peña in Aragon.
Yeah.
Which is one of my top 10 life experiences in travel. It's extraordinary. If you have nothing else to do, I suggest you walk it.
It's a gorgeous place for sure.
And I've also done the Vadinense, which is very peculiar, but quite interesting. Very Games of Thrones-y. And I've also done the Castellano Aragonés, which you will recognize from various Clint Eastwood movies, as well as Dr. Zhivago, as it was a great film shooting territory in Spain in the 60s and 70s.
The spaghetti westerns.
Yeah, but Dr. Zhivago also. I remember walking through a pine forest and I said, I feel like I've been here before. And it was the scene in the pine forest where Zhivago was scouted out by Strelnikov's horsemen and taken to the armored train.
Wow.
So how's that for déjà vu?
Yeah, good eye.
Anyway, I quite enjoyed the Del Norte. It's not at all like the other Caminos. And if you're at all used to the Française, it's a bit of a shock. Along the Française, you've got a whole society which is oriented to pilgrim support. You're going through all of these little pueblos, an occasional city. There's no other scene on the ground but the Camino. I mean, we have revived that part of Spain from a level of abject poverty which you only understand when you've done a few of the off-piste back road Caminos. The Del Norte, it goes along a society which has been flourishing and existing for ages. Bunches of little seaports, regional capitals, university towns, cathedral towns. They're still very happy to see you. They're very supportive. People are really helpful. But it's also primarily a holiday zone in Spain for all of the people who are from the heat-drenched central part of the country, Madrid, Toledo, all the way down to the south coast. They head to the North Shore. It's called España Verde for a reason. Beautiful hills, gorgeous beaches. I think some of the best in the world. Wonderful seafood. So If you want a Camino which is also a bit of a holiday, this is the one you want. I've done a lot of the tough Caminos. I'm now at an age where I don't have to challenge myself anymore. All I have to do is be able to get to the next spot.
So we are today going to focus on a section that is about 73 kilometers running from Colombres to La Isla. This is basically right where the Camino del Norte enters Asturias. Colombres is right on that border. And the first stage of this is Colombres to Llanes, which is about 25 kilometers. And acknowledging, as always, that everyone walks their own walk, everyone has their own pace. Stages are going to be different for everyone. But just as an organizational tool, our first section is Colombres to Llanes. Take me back to Colombres. Take me to the starting spot. What do you recall about that little town?
I've never stayed there, actually. I remember having a coffee and a bocadillo at the Café Capri there, and two Quebec pilgrims watching me intently because they'd never been able to get anything for breakfast in Spain more than a bit of, packaged Madeleine. And I was enjoying, a tortilla française where they put the omelette in a bocadillo. It's a good second breakfast, no?
Absolutely.
So I was able to pontificate on the basis of many Caminos on ways of staying alive in the morning. So I've never stayed there, but it seemed to be a nice place.
So La Franca is the first little spot along the walk in this stage, mostly just a highway town.
It is, but the autoroute it was put through about 12 years ago.
Yep.
The Cantabrian autoroute. I remember when they were building it, and just crossing it was an adventure. You were escorted through it by road workers who were always very cheerful, would come up and shake your hands, give you big hugs, and say Buen Camino. The delight of the Spanish at us doing these strange pilgrimages is palpable. It's actually humbling at times. But still, now that it's up, the noise is not so bad. Although you're only a kilometer or so away for most of the walk, you barely hear it. Generally, you don't hear it. And it also means that for those who have trouble on some of the paths, which can be tortuous at times, the country road is empty.
And there is a choice because a couple kilometers after La Franca, the official route still insists on following that country highway, whereas a variant will take you just across the train tracks out to the coast. And then certainly what I prefer, which is a lovely stretch right along the coastline, admittedly rocky in places, some small ups and downs, but lovely, lovely views.
I've done that several times. It's twice of the 3 times I've done the Do Norte. The third time I've been developing some fairly serious arthritis, which I've had a lovely ankle operation since. And so I knew the twists and turns were not going to be an agreeable experience. So I went along the road, was fine. Where else have I stayed? Oh, in Buelna, where I booked into a Casa Rural, which was a few minutes walk from the albergue. I tend to go for Casas Rurales when I walk because, look, I'm getting old. I want my own bathroom. And you meet a very interesting bunch of people in them. Spanish professionals, French, you get some English and Irish pilgrims who are of a generation which enjoy comfort. I no longer take a lot of delight in sharing a room with 12 Germans, no matter how nice they are. I rationalize it, of course, by saying I'm leaving up space in the albergues for younger pilgrims and those without money. And I pat myself on the back for my self-sacrifice. I mean, you miss out on a lot of the social aspect, but you can pick that up in the cafes along the way.
Sure.
It's not the same, and I don't think anybody should take any shade for doing one or the other.
No.
It's a matter of where you are in life.
And Buelna has, technically, in name, it still has an albergue. It used to be an albergue in the sense that it was a hostel with beds. Now it's entirely private rooms. Still calls itself an albergue.
Oh.
But for those who want the traditional albergue experience, they just have to continue a few kilometers more past Buelna to Pendueles, which has a couple of albergues, including a Donativo, Aves de Paso, and a little grocery store and a cafe as well. So it's a good stop along the way.
There's some gorgeous nearby beaches, the Playa Intermares. Now, pilgrims have got to be reminded that they're on the Bay of Biscay, which has got incredible undertow. I'm a good swimmer, but I would never go in more than waist deep.
What's nice is that some of those beaches there are quite shallow going out a ways. So it
Yep.
does set up well for wading and splashing without, going into deep water.
Yeah, but be really careful. I remember talking with a civil guard I met on a beach. She was extraordinary. Do you know the Spanish actor Rossi de Palma?
No.
Worth looking up. She's in a lot of our films. This was an athletic Olympic level version of that woman. She was a search and rescue diver for the Guardia Civil. And then she said, look, it's more accurate to call her a search and recover diver. She says every year there's 3 or 4 swimmers who don't make it. So don't be a fool, but enjoy the beaches. When the weather's great, the North Shore will give you the most miraculous sunrises and sunsets on the planet. The next exciting bit, I think, is the Bufones.
And this is a stretch where you leave the road, but even on arthritic ankles, the walking is more manageable here. It's more on a dirt track.
Yeah, and it was workable for me. My surgeon said, do you do a lot of walking? And I said, actually, I've clocked it. I've done 11,770 kilometers in Spain and France. And he looked at me and I said, the Camino. He said, oh my God. But he said, we'll fix you up. We'll get you back on the road in a year or two. And I'm optimistic. Anyway, get along to the Bufones, which is where holes in the ground allow jets of seawater to shoot out, just like a geyser.
Yeah.
I have seen some travelers' dogs get really terrified by this. Nothing quite like seeing a few German shepherds shoot off into the distance, howling in terror. Well, I like cats. What can I say? So don't stand too close to the edge, but at worst, you'll probably get just an awful lot of really cold seawater in your face if you do. I saw this happen to some poor Slovak pilgrim, and I'm afraid her friends were really unkind, and they had a good laugh over it. There's another place, I think about 10, 12 kilometers on near Andin where you get some more Bufones, but I Google Earth the paths when I have insomnia. I think beyond that, there's just a cliffside path by the Bayota, which is, I mean, it's a cliff. So don't go over the edge because it's a good 15, 20 meter drop. You don't want to do that. There is a path down to the beach at the far end. Now, North American pilgrims who are not used to how Spanish beachgoers wear can reflect their inclination for freedom may want to turn their eyes away from the beach. But, this is Spain. We should grow up. And as one of my Spanish friends said, Franco's dead. We are free now. So they take this to the degree they wish. So this is great. And you just keep on going and you get to Llanes itself.
There's one decision for people to make towards the end of this walk. There is a route split after Andrin. And so you can either follow the highway through Coué, or you can follow the GR, which goes up a little bit. It's a dirt track. It skirts the edge of a golf course, goes up higher, gives you better views.
Yep.
Doesn't add that much. Doesn't even add a full kilometer to the walk, but it gets you off pavement, gets you better views, more quiet walk. So I just encourage people to make that choice if they can.
Yeah, unless it's pouring rain, I would do that myself.
Yeah.
And it does pour rain in the north of Spain sometimes. España Verde.
But then you make it to Llanes, and that is definitely one of the highlights of Asturias.
Yes, it's great. I've stayed at several places. A little hotel, Puerto de Llanes, which is run by a very friendly young couple. I've stayed at the Posada del Rey, which is right in the middle of medieval Llanes. Remember, this is a really old seaport, and you can tell it's a harbor town. It's quite close to the very small Basilica of Our Lady of the Consejo. Now, for church-going pilgrims, and I know a lot of pilgrims like the evening masses in the pueblos along the way, this is very difficult to find along the Do Norte. Most parishes are open on Sundays, maybe once a week. It's not every night the way you see on the Frances. However, this little basilica, which is about 8 or 9 centuries old, is going to be open in the evening and is well worth a visit. It's got incredible carvings, a little plaque which commemorates the 65 sailors from Llanes who set out on the Spanish Armada, didn't come back. This is a good example of an old medieval town church, which would have been the center of the life of the people for centuries and centuries. It's a different world. I had a very interesting story there. And so I go in and I take a pew on the epistle side by a pillar so that if the sermon is totally incomprehensible for me, which it usually is given my limited Spanish, I could just lean back and zone out. Anyway, I met some Czech pilgrims, and one of them had done the entire Mass kneeling on the stone. Fine, she's a young woman. You can do that when you're young. Try to kneel on stone for 10 minutes. Tell me how it does you. So anyway, I think, okay, she's insane, but we're all nuts on the Camino. If we were normal, we wouldn't be here. So after the Mass, she and her two buddies saw me heading up to the sacristy to get my credentials stamped, because that always impresses the people in Santiago. He's not only been to bars, he's been to churches. And now the sacristy is really interesting for US pilgrims. It was painted the same year as the Declaration of Independence.
Okay.
By a monk who knew what he was doing. So anyway, they followed me in, and they obviously had not done this before, though they had credentials and everything. And so they were a little nervous. Am I going to get into trouble for following this Canadian? However, the priest was pleased to meet me. He had been to Montreal's Expo 67 a half century ago, and he loved it. So we had a good talk about that. Our common language was in French. And so I interpreted for the Czechs. They had no Spanish, but their English was excellent. Well, better than most North Americans, actually. Anyway, the three of them had walked from Brno in the Czech Republic. She was doing it in performance of a vow. The priest wasn't sure that I was interpreting her correctly, because, of course, this means months of walking. And so after a bit of back and forth, he was convinced that I was interpreting correctly. She didn't tell us what the vow was. And afterwards, talking with her companions, they didn't know either.
Wow.
But they felt it was too much of a solitary pilgrimage for their friend to walk without companions. The priest was quite taken aback, and then translated all of this into Spanish for the sacristan and her assistant, and they were all agog. His voice was on the edge of breaking as he had us kneel for a blessing. He was really moved by this. So I let them go, and they were going off to eat vegetarian paella somewhere. And I met them in Santiago a few weeks later, and they were just glowing. The Camino is a place where things like this can happen. Totally out of our experience, totally out of our frame of living. Who knows what was going on, but something's going on. I could talk to you about the restaurants in Llanes, but after an incident like that, really, no matter how good the steak was, it's all superfluous.
Just to note that there are many restaurants. It's a good place for eating, good place for street life.
Yeah.
If you haven't had your first glass of Asturian cider yet, good spot for that as well.
Oh, yes. I've not mentioned Asturian cider. It's very sneaky. It goes down easily, and then you try to stand up.
You go down easily as well
It's
afterward.
very powerful stuff. I think it's 12 to 15%. Of course, I'm not even talking about Orujo Blanco, which helps settle the stomach with your espresso after the end of dinner.
Well, there we are. That's the first of our stages, 25 kilometers from Colombres to Llanes. And then the second stage, always a little tricky figuring out where to divide this one up. It's a product of accommodation limitations sometimes. So I'm calling it Llanes to Piñeres de Pria, which is 21 kilometers. A lot of people will make it a long day, push on to Riba de Sella, but we'll get there a little bit later.
Yeah, it's nice if you can. I'm 72. I do short days now.
Yep.
But you're right. There's enough flexibility in accommodation. You can do that easily. I just went as far as Nueva and just spent a lot of time looking at the sea as I walk along. I live inland, so looking at the sea is a thrill for me. I did have a nice stop at the ruined monastery at San Antolin, crawled over a fence and had some fruit and cheese, and then walked along the San Antolin beach to bathe my feet. Really quite spectacular. Then I walked into Nueva, which is a nice little village, which I don't know if they have an albergue, but there's 4 or 5 other places you can stay. Do they have an albergue?
They do not. No.
They do not.
But Piñeres is not too far after Nueva. You're close at that point.
It could stand an albergue. I've been staying at the Casa de Indianos, Don Tomas. The Indianos houses They're these Gothic buildings. They were built by immigrants returning from the Americas
Yeah.
in the Alfonso 12th, 13th period. That is between about 1880, 1930. And actually flaunt their wealth and rub it in the noses of the people they left behind. These houses are great. They're very comfortable, but they all look as if the Adams family would be quite at home in them. But it's run by a Spanish family. They're great fun. There's a wonderful sidreria where carnivores can go totally bananas. And there's a nice new restaurant, the Bar Misares, which gave me the best home-cooked meal along this whole stretch of the Del Norte. It's the sort of place where you take friends you like.
So if we take a step back, you've carried us about 18 kilometers into Nueva. That's most of the way through this stage. It's a stage that has a lot of different little towns sprinkled along the way. I'll mention up front that the official route out of Llanes follows the highway and then back roads. There is a variant, though, that I strongly recommend that involves climbing up onto the coastal wall, and then you just follow the cliffside most of the way to Playa de Po. It's beautiful walking, much better than the official route. So strongly encouraged. And then it's Playa de Po, which a lot of people will laugh at the name, spelled P-O-O.
I know.
And then Celorio, a nice little beach town where the Camino actually goes out onto a little sandy beach and then back off. Goes through Barro, which has the very famous, it was the cover of the first version of my book, Iglesia de Nuestra Señora de los Dolores. It's this church that sits right across an inlet. And so whether you catch it at high tide or low tide, it's a really striking visual.
Great cemetery.
I mean, the whole thing is striking.
No, it's a great cemetery there, actually. I remember taking my lunch with the departed of the village.
I've never once found the church open, but someday I might make it inside.
No, I had a fun visit to the bar there once.
Okay.
I was walking in to the bar, just look, I want a break. I made me some coffee and reason to sit down. And I had my iPod. My comments on Apple about that are available upon application. And so the young bartender said, "What are you playing?" And so I said, actually, it happened to be a number by a friend of mine who's a musician, Megan Jerome. And so we'll put it on the speaker. And so put it on the speaker, and the two old codgers and a young woman sitting there got into it. They started tapping out the rhythm with their sticks. And she started to sashay with the music. Okay, I'm not in Ontario. We don't do this in Ontario. We glower at each other quietly for an hour. I don't know if you've traveled much in Canada, but like each province has got its own particular weird little culture.
Okay.
And ours is isolation. If you know Alice Munro's stories, you understand Ontario. And one of the old guys at the end of it stood up and said, "Mejor to Diana Crot, mejor." I relayed this back to Megan, and so part of her set piece now is they hear the tale from this little bar on the Spanish coastline.
And from there, you continued on along that stretch you described already, past the monastery, the monastic ruins, along the beach, through two other little small towns, Naves and Villa Ormes, where, I should note, they have brought back recently the albergue. It has been reopened as a donativo, so much needed in this stretch to have that. And then Nueva, where you spent the night, where I had a delicious pastry, a wonderful bakery in that town.
Ooh, I'll have to make a point of going back.
Something to look forward to next time.
Yes.
And then, Piñeres de Pria, where there's not much. There's a small private albergue where a woman hosts a small number of pilgrims in her cabana, and then you climb a steep grassy hill up to a church that's just sitting there at the top. It has a Casa Rectoral that's been converted to an albergue. It seems like they add beds to it every year. Nothing else around there, but it's a good space to grab a bed for the night.
It's a gorgeous location.
Beautiful view, great place to just sit out, watch the evening pass by.
We don't do enough of that. They don't have televisions at the albergues. Thank God.
Just make sure that you buy your groceries in Nueva before you climb up to Piñeres de Pria.
Yeah, it's always good advice. They should have a little sign, at the end of a village. They have these signs saying you're now leaving San Juan or wherever. They should also have a sign saying 14 kilometers to the next tienda. as they do in Australia for gasoline.
Yeah, out here in the West US as well.
Ah, well, Ribadesca is a holiday beach town for the Spanish.
And that's in the middle of our last stage, Piñeres de Pria to La Isla, 27 kilometers. And I'm with you in kind of skipping our way right to Ribadesca because that first 10 kilometers of this walk, there's really not too much to say about it.
No, there isn't. I've ended up staying in Ribadesca several times, mainly because I've had bad weather luck on this stretch.
Mm.
Like, you know how in the north of Spain and Galicia, you can be drenched for 3 days running?
Yeah.
The sort of rain where you set out knowing that your boots will be squishing within the hour and there's nothing you can do about it. I had a terrible day once. It was a rainstorm, the sort of wind which pushes you, even people as such as myself who are not dainty or, wraith-like. And I got picked up by a businessman. I don't hitch normally in Spain. It has happened once or twice when my ankle couldn't take it. But he saw me sort of cowering by the side of a church and stopped and said, "Get in, get in." And I was not going to say no. And so I figured, look, I'm heavy enough that stranger danger is not a problem for me. The Spanish are very transparent, and you could tell that he was a good guy. So that's all right. And he drives me in to Ribadesca, and he said, "You should stay here. My cousin runs it." It turned out to be a very pricey hotel, the Ribadesca Playa. I think it's about 80 or 90 euros a night now.
That guy's out there picking up pilgrims all day long.
I don't know. But anyway, so I go in looking like a drowned rat, water cascading from me. I mean, I was sorry what I did to his expensive car's upholstery. I was like a sponge. But I go up there and they looked at me. They upgraded me immediately and sent up a staffer with a basket of fruit and a double shot of cognac. And said, "He'll take your clothes to be washed," which they did on the house.
All right.
A bunch of the very boat clients were looking at me with a mixture, astonishment. What is this maniac? And, another of these crazy foreigners who comes here. What can we do? However, one of them came up with his 2 kids to tell them to shake hands with me, because I was a pilgrim from far away. So, I could forgive them their Mercedes. This is just part of the spontaneous, mixed nature of Spanish society and how they respond to us. It's extraordinary. Just be open to it. You'll have some very good memories. I did go to a mass at the modern church in the old town. Not that there's a lot of old churches. The Civil War was very mean in that part of the world. If you get into histories of the Civil War, reading about it in the north of Spain, you need to go out for a walk in the fresh air after every 20 or 30 pages. It was a horrific experience, which has marked how Spain looks at itself. Anyway, they had some very bizarre wall paintings, but quite remarkable, all from the late 50s, early 60s. But you're just going into a huge modern town church. Aside from the paintings, there was nothing to recommend it. The other problem is leaving Ribadesca. A lot of pilgrims take the wrong path up into the hills. It's on a recreational sendero, Sendero Verde. The Camino is well marked, but pay attention to the markings, not to your nose.
It's an interesting layout for the city because you come in, it's a long descent. You're on the highway for a little bit, and then you cut down and you kind of come in through the back door into the old town of Ribadesca. And it's a compact little grid of streets, lots of bars, lots of services there. Then you go past the tourism office, cross the bridge over the River Sella, and then you're on a beachfront promenade, just walking along this long but narrow sandy beach through the other half of town.
Yeah, lots of people walking their dogs.
Yep.
But not on the beach.
The one big highlight to me in Ribadesca that you haven't touched on yet is the cave of Tito Bustillo. Have you ever managed to get a visit to see the prehistoric cave art there?
No, it never happened for me. On the days where I was passing through, I got mixed messages on whether or not it was open or not.
It's pretty neat. And this section of the walk is kind of bracketed by 2 caves that you can visit that have this prehistoric cave art. The first one requires a detour along the GR from Unquera. You can get out to the Cueva del Pindal, which is a cave that opens up to the sea. It's a marvelous location. And the Tiro Bustillo is about a kilometer, half a kilometer in off the Camino, just on the outskirts of Ribadesella. You generally should book ahead, like a reservation, especially if you want an English language tour. But it's a great visit. And if you're ever there on a hot day, what's great about it is that the caves are cool year round. So you're going to get yourself a nice hour of effectively air conditioning as you check out some prehistoric art.
Now I have to go back.
There's always a reason.
It doesn't take much convincing of me.
Well, we have about 17 kilometers onward from Ribadesella, and the first stretch, provided you follow the correct route as you've advised us, is mostly just quiet back roads, and it will lead you past the albergue in this section, San Esteban de Leces, which is about 5 kilometers after Ribadesella. And then you finally get back to the coast about 7.5 kilometers after Ribadesella in the village of La Vega.
Yes, I've just walked through there. I think I stopped once or twice.
There's a bar down on the beach just off route.
Yes. That was interesting because there were a couple there, a woman and her transgendered partner who was in the German army. They were doing rehab work with military people who had been injured during service, which at the time they were working with people who had been damaged from their NATO exercises in Afghanistan. A very dedicated person, loved their work. And if you know people who work in rehab, it's tough.
Yeah.
It's really tough. And they have to have a personal religion of healing to be with it. I was very impressed with them. But I remember that. Yep, we had a very long coffee talking, and the Germans, of course, speak English better than we do.
And then you all got to enjoy a lovely walk because this is really the last big burst of coastal walking, especially for people who are walking the Camino Primitivo, who are splitting off to the Primitivo. This section from La Vega to La Isla, I mean, for me, it's just gorgeous. And especially the stretch through Playa de la Espasa. You know, some of the lovely coastal walking on the Norte, you have to really work for, and maybe you're huffing and puffing or you're navigating some rocky terrain, but this is pretty flat, pretty grassy, and just wide open views.
It's what I imagine California is supposed to be like in my imagination.
It is, yeah.
It's very soothing. People talk about the healing aspect of the water of the ocean, and you know, it's a pile of nonsense until you see it. And then it's real, especially because the Del Norte, it takes work. It's not a walk in the park. And this is part of the reward of it. I stayed at La Isla almost by accident about 10, 12 years ago. And I can't remember why, but I was just sick of walking that day. You know how that happens? It's owned by a now quite elderly Spanish artist from the 50s and 60s who was well known at the time, but not so well known that I remember his name. And his daughters run the place now. I talk about California. It's very California motel-like in terms of its facilities. But the beach is right across the street. You stand at your window, you just look at the beach, and the sunsets are breathtaking there. And the sunrises, because the sun's coming in your window at 5 a.m, are equally spectacular. The water is like glass there. It's an area where you can swim quite safely. Just the physical surrounding on the beach, it did take my breath away, and it was very relaxing, serene, in a way beach resorts normally aren't.
La Isla has a municipal albergue that seems to be closed every other month. I mean, it's been open, it's been closed, it's been open, it's been closed. So
I've been trying to follow it.
Yeah, you got to always confirm in advance. But fortunately, there's a surfer hostel, a private place that's been open pretty consistently for a while now as well.
It is. At times, it's been the only place to eat in La Isla. And the food was prepared by residents of the hostel. And you know, sometimes that can be wonderful. It wasn't that day. But there's a bar, cafe, restaurant towards the exit of the village, which is pretty reasonable. And I think there's a small restaurant attached to a hotel, which is good. It's one of these odd little places where you never know what's going to happen. But it reminds me a little like of, did you ever see the movie Monsieur Hulot's Holiday with Jacques Tati?
No.
Okay, it was done around 1950 in France. And it's by a guy who goes off in a little village resort for his annual holiday. And all kinds of very cheerful mishaps happen to him, a lot of slapstick. But it has a very good feeling of cheer about it. So La Isla, very mellow place.
It's a great place to take a break, relax, and again, if you're on the Primitivo, say goodbye to the ocean because this is the last gasp.
There is a small church there, which is sometimes open in the evenings. I can't figure out any rationale to it. I went to a mass there, just before COVID. We're all just kind of sitting there, and there are some Dutch people, some French people, a couple of the locals. And then a man came in who was disturbed. Like he had clearly had rough years. I mean, he's one of these people who lives outdoors. So he came into the church and he was sat back in a pew and started rocking back and forth. And so two of the regulars went over and sat with him, and they just started holding his hands and steadying him as he was starting to sing to himself. After the service, the guitarist came up and started playing for him until he became quiet. Oh, I mean, this is an interesting moment. People are just spontaneously trying to keep this stranger or odd person functioning. Two of the Dutch tourists afterwards said they had rarely seen anything like this. They said everybody was spontaneous and wise and doing the right thing. They said in Holland, the city would have somebody sent and then they'd go home. He said, here in Spain, I guess, they do it themselves. I'm sure it doesn't happen in lots of places, but it was an example of the kindness of Spanish people just bursting forth. And this is, of course, in a country where if you know their history, they're not always kind to each other.
We have reached the end of our section, 73 kilometers of walking Colombres to La Isla. And Austin, thank you for regaling me with stories along the way.
Well, you won't get bored there. And if you do, it's your own fault. People criticize me for liking the Do Norte. They say, you're there for the beaches and the seafood and, the beauty of the place. And I said, yeah, the club meant Camino. And they look at me and I said, so what? I'm in my 70s. This is a great way to travel. I do not think I'm missing a thing. And so it's an area where you can get what you want. Do you want the history? Do you want the scenery? Do you want the spiritual aspects? It's there. And the Spanish are there to help us.
Dr. Laura Hydak is a Spanish and writing teacher at Barnard College and Rutgers University. She's the author of Saints, Sinners, and Songs, The Rehabilitation of the Indiano in Contemporary Spanish Culture. So, Dr. Laura Hydak, thank you for speaking with me about this topic of the Indianos in Spain. Before we get into the heart of the matter, let's just start with your background. What got you interested in this subject matter? What drew you to it?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak about Indianos. I first became interested in Indianos when a Spanish tour guide told me a story about an Indiano from northern Spain who returned to his hometown. And when he returned, the local villagers who did not immigrate were so jealous both of his fortune and of the ideas and knowledge and modernity that he acquired from immigrating that they tied him to the back of a horse-drawn cart and dragged him to his death.
Wow.
That's sort of so I said, wow, that's really interesting. There must be a story there. And I think that story encapsulates, it didn't always happen with every Indiano, of course, but I think that story encapsulates sort of this tension about when the Indiano returns between often poor, conservative villagers who did not immigrate and the contrast with the wealthy Indiano who does come back, often with liberal ideas and often of the Enlightenment. They were sometimes called afrancesados or Frenchified when they returned. Often it had to do with the ignorance or what the villagers didn't know because they hadn't had the opportunity to leave. Indianos, maybe I should say this definition now, returns to a Spanish immigrant who goes to the Americas and makes a fortune and returns home, or that was the idea. And, there was this dream, sort of similar to, I guess, the American dream, to hacer las Americas, or to do the Americas, which meant to make a fortune in the Americas. And there was also another lema or saying, 5 años y una fortuna. That dream often didn't come true. The statistics are often not clear on that, but I do know that when I was doing research on the Canary Islands, I read somewhere, and I believe this, that about 5% of the immigrants who actually left for the Americas to make a fortune came back wealthy.
Wild.
So I think that's, as I said, statistics are hard to glean of that nature, but I think that's a pretty accurate and maybe even generous, maybe fewer returned wealthy to certain Spanish regions.
And that doesn't even factor in those who didn't return at all.
Right. Yeah. Who stayed, who married, yeah, 100%.
Who died. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Died on the journey, which was certainly treacherous.
The Spanish pursuit in the Americas extended across centuries. Are we looking at people from across those 300 plus years, or is this more of a condensed time period when we're thinking about the Indianos people?
The Indianos, it's a phenomenon that begins with the conquest of the Americas, so post 1492. And I would say it continued on and off to the mid 20th century with high watermarks in the 18th and 19th centuries. Certain Spanish regions had more immigration in certain periods, and that sort of depends on economic factors. In Catalonia, for example, if there was a plague that affected production, a lot of people had to immigrate. So it depends. Different regions had different high watermarks, but it begins on the Siglo de Oro period, so right after the conquest of the Americas, and high watermark 18th, 19th century, and continues really until it just became unfeasible, that dream anymore, for economic reasons.
In this episode, we're really centered on the region of Asturias, but the Camino del Norte passes through, the Basque Country on the east end, Galicia on the west end. Certainly all of those regions were deeply involved in the activities in the Americas. Can you talk a little bit in particular about Asturias, but if you want to extend to the North Coast, that's entirely fine. But what do we know about the regional link between Indianos and all of these narratives that you're talking about?
It's a really great question. I mean, the most famous Indiano is from Santander, so a neighboring region of Asturias. And we talked about the Archivo de Indianos, which was that house, the beautiful, iconic blue house built by an immigrant who made a fortune in Mexico, I believe. So I think I probably might prefer to talk about Antonio Lopez y Lopez, who's from Santander, if that's okay, because I think his story is really iconic and
Yeah.
a lot of twists and turns. And we can get back to Asturias in a minute, but I think one of the most interesting and I think the most famous Indianos is Antonio Lopez y Lopez, who was from the small town of Comillas in Santander, which is about a 30-minute drive from Colombres, because Colombres is right on the border with Santander.
And it's also right on the Camino del Norte. So yeah, we passed right through there.
So in Comillas, Antonio Lopez y Lopez migrated from a very small fishing town. He goes to Cuba. And eventually, and I'm sort of shortening the story here, but eventually he becomes involved in banking and makes a fortune in trading slaves as well. Although eventually the traffic of slaves was prohibited, but a lot of trafficking continued even after it was prohibited in the early 19th century. And slavery didn't become abolished in Cuba until 1886. But Antonio Lopez y Lopez goes to Cuba. He marries wealthy families and from Catalonia. And that's how he builds his huge empire in banking, in shipping, and also trafficking in slaves. So he was, with all this money, a lot of his money financed in Barcelona, where he eventually set up his banking, and he was married to a woman whose family was from there. A lot of this Indiano capital funded these iconic places in Barcelona, like the Parque Güell, for Eusebi Güell, who was also involved in slave trafficking. He was also a very wealthy Indiano. They also founded hospitals and did a lot of philanthropic work. So a lot of Indianos have been remembered as philanthropists, and they did contribute a lot to the modernist architecture in Barcelona, which is also in Comillas to a lesser extent. But they contribute a lot and had been remembered primarily in that role until the 20th century. There's actually a statue, or there was a statue of Antonio Lopez y Lopez in a famous square in Barcelona. But it was taken down in 2018 because of his background in slave trading. And that was a very controversial decision. In general, Catalonia has done more to critique the Indiano legacy, because a lot of the fact that, these philanthropists, their background in slave trading, a lot of that has been hidden or not talked about from the public record. In my experience in Comillas, they're more hesitant to talk about it. And you will often find defenses such as, well, yes, maybe Spain and some Indianos were involved in the slave trade, but not so much as Britain. So there's a little bit of defensiveness there. And just controversy too about, should we let this statue stand? If we let it stand, should it have some sort of plaque or something detailing the history so that, people are more aware of the full story? But Antonio Lopez y Lopez and his son, he had a son too, and the whole family are, I think, the most iconic Indiano family that exists in Spain and is still remembered in the public eye. But I think to get back a little bit to Santander and Asturias, what most Spaniards think of when they think of Indianos are the houses. And we mentioned one, the Archivo, which is breathtaking, but these houses that dot the coast of northern Spain. And I also want to say here that certainly not all Indianos were involved in slave trafficking at all. A lot of them made money as businessmen. That happened in a lot of I interviewed some descendants of Indianos in Asturias, and, their families made wealth not through slave trafficking or through shipping, but through commerce.
Yeah. So there's two things there I'd love to follow up on. We'll talk about the architecture in more detail in a little bit. The story that you just offered of Lopez y Lopez, that's the kind of story that I expected to be associated with Indianos people, right? The sort of conquering hero coming back, wealthy, throwing their money around a little bit, maybe in some pro-social ways, in some self-serving ways. All of that made sense to me. But then I think back to where we opened and that story that you told, and then also the research that you've done, the piece that you wrote, Saints, Sinners, and Songs, which really made me want to talk about the Indianos people because it is so counterintuitive. It is so unexpected to me in terms of how I would expect these people to be perceived, welcomed home, and treated. So could we go into that in more detail?
Yeah, I think the reception and their legacy has changed. It's hard to generalize, obviously. So
Of
it's not like
course.
every Indiano got the same reception in every town. But I
Yeah.
think if we go back to the Siglo de Oro period and look at the literature of the time, Indianos are often sort of a caricature, made fun of. They're often seen as the nouveau riche, who's trying to show off ostentatiously their wealth because they come from humble origins, but would often, like anyone, have new money, you want to show it off. And there's a couple plays that I've read, La Verdad Sospechosa, that sort of makes fun of the Indiano character. And also it gets really interesting too, because the Indianos come back very wealthy and they try to marry into the aristocracy, which you can talk about purity of bloodline and
Yeah.
whatnot. And so they were a threat that they would disrupt the established social order, basically just because they were wealthy, not because they could trace their lineage to the Duke or the Duchess or the King or Queen or whatnot. In fact, to go back to Lopez, Antonio Lopez, for just 1 second, he actually became the Marquis de Comillas, so he got a noble title. And a lot of Indianos would get noble titles through political connections or simply buying them,
Mm.
with their money. Antonio Lopez is often known as the Marquis de Comillas, even though he doesn't have a royal background or an aristocratic background. So, but I think in the Siglo de Oro, to go back to, how they were received in the Siglo de Oro in literature, often a caricature. And I mentioned the story that we began with of how, there was a lot of fear, hatred, and jealousy. But I think over time, so if you go a little bit further, early 20th century, maybe even late 19th, they're remembered as philanthropists. They made modernity possible because the Indiano capital they brought back from all the businesses they had in the old colonies in Cuba and Mexico. A lot of that funded for Spain to become developed, running water, hospitals, libraries. They used their money to invest in the country, and that, was really important. But what's happening now in the early 21st century is that some of the nefarious dealings that what they were involved in is coming to light. And actually, there was a great documentary that came out from Catalonia that is called, it's in Catalan, but I'll translate to English, Slave Traders, Catalunia's History. It's actually called in Catalan, Negreiros la Catalunya Esclavista. And it's all about, revealing these famous Indianos from Catalonia and their involvement in it. So I think, Indianos have had a variety of receptions, from made fun of to envied to admired and now really questioned in some Spain.
As part of your research, you were in Colombres, you were in Comillas, talking with descendants of Indianos. What are one or two stories that stick out in your memory from those conversations?
What I got in Colombres, I talked to these women who were, descended from families. It was just the story of also the work ethic of how much their relatives at a very young age, 17 or 18, took the ship across a very, often third class cabin, hard journey. And the stories that they would often sleep in the store they would work in, the immigrants, once they got there, after finding cousin or relative, someone who they knew who could take them in their community, and just their admiration for someone who worked hard, built a lot of capital, and then came back to build a home. That's what I remember from Asturias and Colombres was the pride these women felt. And a lot of them still lived in houses in Colombres. And while the Archivo, that beautiful blue house, is perhaps the biggest and most ostentatious, Colombres is filled
Hmm.
with other Indiano homes, some of which are not so, opulent. There's also one called the Casa de Piedra in Colombres, which is an important cultural and a center for the city. So they'll have book clubs there. And I think while the Archivo is special and an archive, I think the Casa de Piedra is more embedded in the fabric of the community because it serves the residents of the community. I also attended recently in Spain, there are all these fairs that celebrate Indianos in the north of Spain. And there's one in Colombres. They started in Begur in Catalonia, the fairs did, but there's one in Colombres, which I attended. And I attended a beautiful concert in a local church where they were singing songs from Cuba and from other countries, Mexico. So I think the Indiano legacy now has turned into celebrating in some ways the influence that came back from Latin America.
It seems really complicated, and this is not foreign to us in the United States, where we are constantly grappling with our history and trying to reconcile some of the darker, unsavory aspects with the parts that legitimately bring us pride. But you've, in this conversation, talked about how the Indianos some of them are being reviled today for their connections to the slave trade. Others were reviled on the moment of return for being different or because of jealousy or envy. And then there's also this whole positive aspect about how they helped Spain economically develop, how they brought back all of these different cultural traditions and influences. And so is that where we are in Spain today with this kind of mixed reaction that is being navigated and reconciled in real time?
That's a good question. Yes, I think the questioning of the slave trade is primarily in Catalonia and is still extraordinarily controversial topic. I think different regions have different attitudes towards Indianos, with Catalonia being the most critical, but I think that might change in the future. But yes, I mean, I think the Indiano as a figure is just so complicated and has brought so much, something positive, something's negative. And the Indiano also becomes a symbol for just some people who did immigrate, and brought back music and food. So you can even take it beyond the Indiano a bit. I'm thinking in Catalonia, I attended a wonderful concert of habaneras. The habanera is a musical genre that was invented in Cuba in the 19th century, but it falls out of popularity in Cuba, but becomes really popular in Catalonia and other parts of Spain where it's sung all the time. So behind these immigration stories of Indianos or whatnot, you have circulation of cultural products and ideas and people and languages. I mean, the Spanish they speak in the Canary Islands is much more similar to Cuban Spanish than Peninsular Spanish. And that has to do with the Canary Islands always historically had a lot of immigration, especially to Cuba. That just has to do with viajes de ida y vuelta, the return, the circular nature of the migration. But yes, I think it's a very mixed bag in Spain now, as opposed to Indianos and what they represent, precisely because they represent so much. And you could look at them from so many different ways.
Yeah. You've already touched on this in a couple different ways, but I still want to ask the question, just for pilgrims who are walking through Comillas, walking through Colombres, this whole area touched by the Indianos people still today, what are some ways that they might be able to engage with this history beyond sort of looking at the buildings and admiring their beauty? Like, are there other ways that they might be able to engage with Indianos history while they're walking through?
Yes, I mean, a lot of the buildings you can go in and visit, and there's some that are hotels. I'm not sure you'd want to stay in there, but the Archivo de Indianos is a whole museum that you can enter And actually, Indiano tourism has become sort of a niche industry in Comillas, in Asturias, in Galicia, certainly in Catalonia. So you could look at the buildings, you could read literature. I could send a list of, I mean, they're probably in Spanish, but a lot of them translated. Clarín has a Boronia, which is a very sad story about an Indiano returning. So if anyone wanted to do a little bit of reading before, they could certainly do that. Also, just the musical traditions that I mentioned, the Catalan Habanera is linked to Indianos, so one could listen to that. There's also these fairs that I mentioned, that if any of the walks coincided with Indiano fairs, which are in Colombres, in Catalonia, in Galicia, they're often in the summer due to the weather, sometimes early fall as well. But you could attend an Indiano fair, which, there's a certain tourist element, so you might see things being sold at a big campground that aren't super Indiano. I remember in Columbus, I saw an Indiano haircut being advertised, and you gotta take everything with a grain of salt.
Yep.
But there's programs. You could do wine tastings. You could do all sorts of things, lectures. We didn't talk about the Indiano architecture that much.
I'd love to hear more if you have additional thoughts on it.
I'm not an architecture expert, but what I do know about the Indiano architecture is that it's often done in a colonial style, which recalls the places and the countries that Indianos immigrated to in the Americas.
Oh,
And what you will always see, or almost always see, is a palm tree planted in the garden of an Indiano home as a reminder of the countries they immigrated to. Palm trees and other flora and fauna too from the country, but especially that palm tree was a symbol of where they went and bringing what they brought home. And just the wide variety of Indiano homes too throughout Spain.
I mean, I think about the color. The colors are really distinct. Like you mentioned the sky blue of the Archivo, which there are other buildings in Colombres. There's an albergue that is the same sort of sky blue colors. So it seems like there's a very distinct color scheme to the houses as well.
Yeah, and that's something I actually honestly can't comment on, but that's a great question. Why? Because I've seen them in all sorts of bright colors, and why that is, I'm not sure, other than what I can guess is simply to draw attention. They built these homes to say, hey, look at me, I made a fortune. Here's what I have, so let me paint it a super bright color.
Yeah. I didn't realize coming in that this was going to be sort of a Great Gatsby in northern Spain narrative, but I guess it kind of is.
No, for sure. Yeah. And actually, one way I guess a pilgrim might think about it is the connections between the American dream or the Great Gatsby or the stories that we have in our culture versus how they connect to the Spanish culture. Spanish immigrants took advantage of the old colonial ties when it wasn't possible to make money in Spain or in these impoverished rural, often seaside towns where a lot of them came from. They had to immigrate. And that's something that in a lot of countries, our own, certainly other countries today, one can relate to. And then what I wrote about in my dissertation was how and why the image of the Indiano has changed. So instead of being only a white, heterosexual Spanish male, why literature and culture has really changed that image and thinking about other narratives.
Awesome. I've seen the palm trees and I've wondered, and so I'm so glad to know that little detail.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Laura. This was really informative.
Thank you. I love talking about it. It's really an honor to be on this podcast.
Dr. Mark Pizzato is a professor of theater and film at UNC Charlotte. He's the author of European Cave Churches and Chinese Temples as Neurotheatrical Sites, as well as the article Cave Rituals and the Brain's Theater, among other things. So Mark, thank you again for speaking with me. One of the fun things about diving into the research available on places and subjects you're already familiar with is that you discover entirely new angles you've never imagined. And that was true for me when I was hunting around for someone to talk with about prehistoric cave art on the northern coast of Spain. And once I discovered your article on cave rituals and the Brain's Theater, I knew I had to know more. So I'm really excited to be able to talk with you. And let's start on a broader, more conceptual level. When you write about neurotheatrical sites, what do you mean exactly?
So I've been writing about prehistoric cave art in relation to theater because that's what I teach at University of North Carolina in Charlotte. I mostly teach theater, but I do teach related courses including one on religious buildings. And that developed through research on a book that was published last year and a sequel I hope to publish in a couple more years. Because I've also been visiting, along with prehistoric caves, I've been visiting churches in Europe and had the chance to visit temples in China. So I became fascinated by the theatricality of both. I became increasingly interested in the beginnings of theatricality, far beyond or prior to the ancient Greeks where we usually start. And so when I teach theater history, I actually start with the prehistoric caves, the art in them, and how they were theatrical spaces, probably used for ritual, and there's different theories about that.
Where does the neuro part come into this? So we have the idea of theater and prehistory. What's the neuro part?
Yeah, so I also became interested in how neuroscience helps us to understand the theatricality of everyday life, along with the art of theater and problems of too much theater in politics. I've been fascinated for a long time, and with my original graduate work using psychoanalytic theory to try and understand the relation of consciousness and what Freudians or Lacanians call the unconscious, right? Mm-hmm. We often use that term, but neuroscience has given us great insights on that, and especially since in the last few decades. So I started reading neuroscience in the 1990s, and then have published several books applying neuroscience to theater and film initially, and then starting to apply it also to the prehistoric cave art that I was able to visit in Europe. There's a book I published in 2016 called Beast People on Screen and in Your Brain. There I was exploring the theatricality of certain films involving vampires, werewolves, lab hybrid animal-human creatures, and Planet of the Apes movies. Recent films I thought would be interesting through going way back to prehistory and speculating on or theorizing about why there are so many animal-human hybrids. Actually, there aren't that many, there's a small number, but how those relate to the many animal figures and the greater connection to animals, wild animals, of our prehistoric ancestors reflected in the cave art. So that book, is kind of framed by prehistoric cave art, looking at beast people in recent films, and then considering the animal-human drives from our subconscious or body-brain, bottom-up neural systems in various areas of the brain or networks with certain hubs. So I've been very influenced by affective neuroscience, especially that of Jaak Panksepp, who emphasizes our animal emotions, or how we have need states similar to animals. We don't know if they're experiencing what we call fear or rage, such basic emotions, but they certainly exhibit behaviors that their brains can be mapped more intrusively. And so Panksepp has done that kind of mapping and argued for analogous networks in the human brain of basic emotions. It's a very controversial approach because there's a whole other branch, which I find useful too, a branch of psychology called affective science, where they argue directly against that and say we have core affects of arousal or calmness, pleasure and pain, and then we interpret those with our higher level cognitive brain as meaningful emotions. So those are directly clashing as different theoretical approaches with different evidence. And I think they're actually both valuable because the latter, the affective science approach, really gives more top-down, and Panksepp gives them more bottom-up and emphasizes our animal heritage, whereas the top-down affective science is emphasizing our distinctiveness as humans, and we certainly are with our language and higher order consciousness. But there are dangers to that, how we've evolved as human beings. And, we can see that in history and even current events. So that's what I'm especially concerned about exploring, as reflected in religious buildings, in theater as an art, as well as theatricality in politics and other media today. It's much more speculative, of course, with the prehistoric caves, but those are really interesting sites of neurotheatricality as well, because they certainly can be viewed as theatrical, and they are expressing probably what was inside the brains of the artists who made the art. And how they express that is what different scholars debate. I find very useful the approach of David Lewis Williams and Jean-Claude in France. But David Lewis Williams, a South African anthropologist, has seen parallels between the cave art in Europe, in northern Spain included, and San Bushmen in southern Africa, who have a more continuous tradition of doing rock art that Lewis Williams sees as similar and giving us insights to the cave art from tens of thousands of years ago. So the connection between the human and the animal is something Lewis Williams sees through more recent historical records of anthropologists interviewing the San Bushmen, because they no longer, unfortunately, make the rock art today, but their ancestors did, and they were interviewed. The San Bushmen still live in the Kalahari Desert, which is a very difficult area, but they don't live in the Drakensberg mountain area where they had their ancestors and they've been pushed out by colonization. But they still go into, even today, about weekly, practice trance dances. So they will dance around a campfire for many hours, perhaps all night, go into trance, or certain of them go into trance. Some are more adept at this. And they will connect to their ancestors and to animal spirit guides through what they're hallucinating as threads or lines that can pull on and go upward, and also helping one another to heal by pulling out what's translated as nails or arrows for healing. And the animal spirit guides help them also in hunting, because they still survive that way as foragers. So Lewis Williams argues that the prehistoric cave art may show us both what Henri Breuil, another anthropologist in the mid-20th century, called hunting magic, these large animals that are painted in the caves or etched, or perhaps they're a way to gain skill and power magically over the animals that would be good to hunt. However, recent evidence has shown that most of the bones at campsites were of smaller animals. So that's one interesting aspect, that the prehistoric cave art generally shows very large animals that were in Europe at the time, in the Ice Age. The caves in northern Spain that you mentioned, Tita Bustillo and El Pindal, right, the ones you're particularly interested in, those are good examples with, horses, and some of the other caves also in northern Spain and also in southern France, in the Pyrenees, have woolly mammoths too, and rhinoceroses. There's a famous cave in southern France called Chauvet Cave, and a documentary I'd recommend by Werner Herzog called Cave of Forgotten Dreams, because that one actually has the best preserved art and also the most lifelike looking, even though it's some of the oldest from about 30,000 years ago. So that's quite extraordinary too, that some of the oldest art, the prehistoric cave art is from a period of about 30 or 40,000, there's some in Indonesia that's older, to about 11,000 years ago. So the Chauvet cave shows lions as well.
Wow.
Apparently hunting. But most of the animals in various prehistoric caves I've been able to visit, one cannot go as a tourist into Chauvet because they're trying to keep it preserved. It was just discovered in the 1990s. But the ones, in northern Spain that one can visit, they tend to show large herbivores. So I think you mentioned also Altamira.
Yeah.
And one cannot visit, but there is a nice museum there with a reproduction, so you can see mostly bison in this ceiling painting. It's very beautiful. And so that's one of the mysteries. Why so few humans?
Yeah.
Why few, very intriguing in various caves, animal-human figures? And why so many large herbivores? And they're often floating. The ones in Altamira seem to be sleeping. They're kind of curled up. But many of these animal figures are sometimes very lifelike looking, and sometimes even painted into an indentation in the cave, so they seem like they're coming around, overlapping in the back, and that kind of early use of perspective in painting, which is quite amazing too. And of course, they were painted over thousands of years, so techniques were developed by different people, and some of it's like graffiti, where they're layered over one another, maybe by different groups of people. The key question for me is, how is that expressing the staging of self in relation to otherness in our brains? Because we have the same brains, according to neuroscientists, mostly the same. Anatomically, they even talk about anatomically modern humans of this time period, Upper Paleolithic, 30,000 to 11,000 years ago. Very similar brain structures. And how were they staging consciousness, especially of self in relation to otherness? So the otherness of animals, of the natural environment they were struggling to survive in. It was the Ice Age, so it was very difficult living off the land. And what they might have been projecting as a kind of cosmic theater or metaphysical realm, if they were like, as David Lewis Williams argues, the Sand Bushmen today, with their connection to ancestors and to animal spirits, right? So were they painting animal spirits? Or were they, as David Lewis Williams argues, painting the projections from their brains? So they were going deep in the caves. That's another striking thing, that the cave art is often very deep, and at that time especially, very dangerous to go deep inside, because there were wild animals like bears or even cave lions in those caves, as well as lack of oxygen sometimes. They had to carry firelight with them. And I've been into caves, one in southern France called Nyon, which is very interesting to visit, not far from the Camino, but I recommend it also because there's no electric lighting inside. And so you have to arrange with a guide to go in, and you carry a flashlight. But you experience more of the pure darkness then. One gets a sense of what David Lewis Williams argues, that tens of thousands of years ago, intrepid ancestors of humanity going deep into caves were drawn by something, the mystery of it, but also perhaps starting to hallucinate through the darkness itself, and perhaps lack of oxygen too. And so Lewis Williams argues that they were seeing on the walls already. They weren't coming in and saying, oh, I remember seeing this bison or this horse outside, so I think I'll paint it here. Hold the fire for me, friend. They were hallucinating these things on the walls, and then, marking out what they were seeing, maybe etching first, coming back later and painting in order to share with others in their tribal group. Or some of the cave paintings are very deep and one has to crawl into them. That's what's wonderful actually about the caves in northern Spain. They're less accessible. You have to make arrangements by, I think now you can go online. When I was there, I had to actually make phone calls too, to set up to meet a guide to take you inside, because they're locked off, but the guide can take you in. And I remember some of them, we had to actually crawl into the space. So you do get the experience of how you're going inside Mother Earth, the womb of Earth, or you're going deep into this mysterious space that was much more what these prehistoric people were living on. They were living on the surface of the earth mostly. You might call them cavemen, cave women, but they were either living in a shelter, at the edge. They weren't living deep in the caves. They were living on the surface to find food and migrating. But they were going deep in certain caves, and then, for some reason, being impressed by them, if Lewis Williams is right, actually, having meaningful hallucinations in them, and then creating art to share somehow. So that's part of Lewis Williams' theory, is there are at least two modes of that. One is of the sharing. One is, especially in the deeper caves, where it involves what he calls a kind of vortex experience, because, crawling or crouching and going deep inside in smaller chambers, sharing with one or two people as apprentices maybe to the shaman, like the Sand Bushmen, have shamans communicating with the supernatural. And the other would be in larger chambers, which some of the paintings are, to share with a larger group. And so different kinds of theater spaces in that sense. But in both cases, expressing the staging, what I'm interested in my view, staging the inner theater of conscious and regarding subconscious and maybe supernatural energies, networks.
I know you alluded to this earlier, but one of the things that I was having a hard time wrapping my mind around was how that theory about how the idea of the self is developing or being articulated through these creative processes aligns with the very limited representation of human figures. And interestingly, the cave at the center of this discussion, Tito Bustillo, seems to stand out for having more human representation than some of the others, right?
Well, that's a good question. I remember bringing this up with my students last semester when we were talking about Tito Bustillo, because it's mentioned in that book, A Beast Poop on Screen and a Burn too. And I was having them read the book and showing them some images of Tito Bustillo, because it's famous for its chamber of the vulvas. And so I said to them, are these vulvas? I mean, that's what they're generally called in literature. But I even mentioned in that book, and maybe in the article too from earlier that you found, they look like hoof prints to me. Although they're hoof prints with a kind of line drawn around them and maybe some dots over them. So that's, I guess, why anthropologists often call them vulvas. But they're certainly not an entire female body. No legs, no torso. And so they're either the abstraction of a vulva or, out of context vulva. Maybe that made it even more significant, meaningful, ritually symbolic. I don't know. Or, perhaps because hunting, tracking animals was so important to these people. My alternative idea is that maybe they're also, a way of showing hoof prints and the tracking method. But either way, they are showing the relationship to the natural world and the importance of a certain part of the female anatomy, for reproduction and pleasure. And certainly the prehistoric people were aware of that. And overall, to answer your question, I would say they were much more connected to the natural and animal world than we are. We tend to buy food from the store that's already cut up and packaged in plastic, even if we're cooking it ourselves. And many times we're not even doing that ourselves. So only people who live on the farm are maybe directly connected to the animals and killing them for food. Also, these prehistoric ancestors were scavengers. So they were, when they did get a chance to eat the large animals that were painted in the caves mostly, it was probably because another predator killed them. And that was very dangerous too, because other predators could come or those predators could come back. So I think that the connection to the animal and natural world and being a very vulnerable animal, not superior like humans are in the sense of how we transform all our environments. I'm in a home here that nicely sheltering me from the very hot weather outside with air conditioning. And they were completely, and of course in an ice age, very cold environment, completely vulnerable and immersed in that natural world of animals. And they were not superior to the other animals. They probably saw the large herbivores. In Chauvet Cave, there are lions painted also, so maybe some predators, as amazing, as superior beings in the natural world.
Is that the answer as well to the part of the question about why they didn't represent themselves, why we don't see human shapes? Like, most of what I can think of is Peshmerga, there are a lot of hands, So I see a lot of hands, but not a lot of humans in the cave art in Spain and France that I visited.
Yeah, and what's striking too is how lifelike many of the animal figures are.
Yeah.
And then the humans are like stick figures. So, but they didn't have the media we do to look at ourselves all the time. They didn't even have mirrors.
But they still see each other.
They see each other, that's true. But I think they were seeing much more in the natural world than we do. So maybe the hallucinations, if David Lewis Williams' theory is right, the hallucinations they were having and then copying or marking in their paintings and etchings on the cave walls. He actually calls the cave wall is a kind of membrane to the other world. His theory is they were projecting from their inner, what I call the inner theater, onto the cave as a kind of theater screen that then for them meant this supernatural or spiritual realm beyond. And he argues actually that experiments with altered states of consciousness in the lab today, where they just have people's eyes closed in a sensory limited environment and flash lights at a certain rate on people's closed eyes, produce hallucinations. So it's very easy to produce hallucinations even without substances, and we don't know, they might have been using those too. But just those kind of hallucinations with flashing light at certain rates, and that's been part of the experiment, can then typically create, this is part of what Lewis Williams argues, typically create what one can also see in the caves. So a progression from designs, abstract shapes, which is like the first stage, when that altered state of that is produced in the lab, in today's human brain. But we also see that often in caves. Initially, some abstract shapes. And I think maybe it's Elpindal, or I forget whether it's Tito Bustillo or Elpindal, has this kind of what's called a claviform. It's like an old-style key shape or P shape. When we see repeated abstract shapes, that was probably meaningful for them in some way. Mm-hmm. But Lewis Williams argues that just the painting or etching of abstract shapes might reflect a kind of initial stage of altered state of consciousness. And then there's a vortex experience for today's human brains in the lab. And then there's images hallucinated from today's environment, and then more fantastic images. So there's those several stages. So Lewis Williams argues that that's what we're seeing in the cave art. It's not like a choice to paint in these ways or these types of figures, but projections through the altered states and stages of those in the experience of people going inside the caves. So I think that helps to answer too why there would be the abstract designs and many animal figures, because that's what they were experiencing and valued in their own natural environment.
Yeah. Let's finish up with this. For people who are visiting the caves, and among the three along the Camino del Norte, the most common is probably going to be Tito Bustillo because it's real, it's not a replica, and El Pindal takes a little bit more work, it's a little bit more complicated, a little bit off the beaten path. So Tito Bustillo, unfortunately they can't crawl into the opening. They're not going in by flashlight, and they probably won't have access to psilocybin in support of an altered state of consciousness, but they're going in a group, they have a guide. How would you advise them to try to access that theatricality that is baked into the site? How can we try to access at least a little bit of that when we visit the caves today?
That's a great question. I think reflecting back on my experience and having written too, what's especially important are the animal-human drives, which we experience at least as emotions, maybe related to other animals, as I was saying before. And the most basic ones of those drives are survival and reproduction. So perhaps that also relates to the chamber of the vulvas, right? But along with that, there's territoriality, alliance hierarchy with our social groups, and even the hunter-gatherers had the important aspect of that, though they were probably more egalitarian. There's nurturing care with all mammals, but especially humans, because we're born very prematurely, about half the gestation time that would correlate with other primates, so we're very helpless at birth, and we need that nurturing. And then I would say play is very important. And at higher levels, more distinctively human, well, what's grooming in primates but becomes in us gossip, or ways that we have in and out groups through media today, as well as verbal gossip. And then the highest, most distinctive level would be seeking immortality or meaning and purpose in life. So maybe reflecting on those levels of how we have animal-human emotions related to those, but we become, more abstract and symbolic as humans for good and ill. And then what emotions do you experience going into the cave? Of course, you're in a tour group perhaps with a guide, but still, I think it was in Tito Bustillo, but I'm not sure because I've visited so many caves. But in one of them, the guide actually tapped on one of the stalagmites, a natural cone-shaped stone, but fluid-looking because it's formed by water dripping over thousands of years with mineral. And they're hollow. You wouldn't think so, but they're hollow. And so some like Jean-Pierre Montel, who's written a book on the theatricality of prehistoric caves, he argues that, it's important to consider the musicality of these spaces too. And it's hard if you're in there with other groups and people are talking, but to try to experience the echoing, the sensory deprivation, even if there's electric lighting, and then how, of course, the visual, along with the other sensory elements, create a kind of theatrical effect on you as the visitor, so that you're both a spectator, but also an actor in that space. And then maybe reflect while it's happening, but also later, on how that involves your inner theater and the bottom-up experience of sensory signals through your body as emotions, maybe a little bit of fear, maybe some excitement, joy, maybe the playfulness, which is a key drive, that other mammals have, but for us also is a way that we reflect on and work with our more problematic, higher level seeking of meaning and purpose in relation to the other basic drives and needs. So experiencing some of the playfulness, potentially of the actual space with prehistoric art and of the art itself, and then other sensory aspects in relation to one's own emotion or the inner theater awareness of how I'm staging myself all the time regarding other people like you right now and others or otherness that might even be metaphysical.
Thank you, Mark. This is really fascinating stuff to consider. Definitely has me thinking about these caves in a different light, and I appreciate you sharing it with me.
Well, thank you very much. These are great questions. I love thinking again on those particular caves as well.
Variants don't play as large a role in this section as others, but there are still some important decisions to make. In the first stage, there are two splits. First, after La Franca, you can follow the highway to Buelna, as Austin did on his most recent walk, or follow a footpath along the coast. The latter is rocky in places, but has some lovely views, and includes a very memorable natural bridge to walk across. Later on, after Undrine, the official route is once again roadbound, while the GR variant gets you on a gravel track. In the second stage, the only variant of note comes right at the beginning. Follow the coastal walkway by climbing the steps up from the Playa del Sablón, taking it onward to Po. And amazingly, there are no variants to recommend in the third stage. Though keep Austin's point in mind about the pedestrian track leaving Ribadesella, that should be avoided. Setting the variants aside, there's a ton to recommend in this stretch. The Indianos' houses of Colombres, including the Archivo, the walk through the Bufones, beautiful Llanes and Ribadesella, the beachside bars in Celorio, and the lovely church after Barro, the stunning coastal trail to Playa de la Espasa, and of course the caves with prehistoric art bracketing this section, Pindal and Tiro Bustillo. Heck, there are even Donativo albergues in Colombres, Pendueles, Villormes, and Duesos, just off route near the Playa de la Espasa. God, the Norte is great. That's all for this episode. Thanks again to Austin Cook for sharing stories from his 3 trips on the Camino del Norte. Thanks as well to Dr. Laura Hydak. I recommend tracking down her dissertation if you can, titled Saints, Sinners, and Songs, The Rehabilitation of the Indiano in Contemporary Spanish Culture. And finally, thanks to Mark Pizzato, whose article, Cave Rituals and the Brain's Theater, can be found online. All episodes of the Camino Podcast can be found on Spotify, Apple, SoundCloud, and YouTube. You can reach me at CaminoPodcast@gmail.com and through the Camino Podcast Facebook page. And you can support the pod on Patreon at patreon.com/Dave Whitson. Thanks for listening, and back again next week.